Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city, or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions that you may have during the conversation into the Q&A box. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all following the webinar in a follow-up email. And all resources that you see shared as links in the chat will also be compiled and shared in the follow-up email to webinar registrants. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we begin, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Later this afternoon, we will be partnering with the Children's Funding Project to bring you a conversation on how states and communities are maximizing American Rescue Plan funding for kids at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week on January 25th, we have Families on Shaky Ground uncloaking and addressing the realities of persistent instability. Then we'll be starting off the month of February with Big Bets Part 3, Community Schools Accelerating Equitable Recovery early in the afternoon, or at 3 p.m. And the following week, Accelerating Literacy Through Same Language Subtitling, co-sponsored by First Book. Registration and more information for these will be posted in the chat box now. Joining you now is Sarah Torian, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesday session entitled, The Hurt Could Last a Lifetime, Data, Growing Gaps, and Rays of Hope. As we did last year, we're beginning this new year by returning to the data in order to root our work in an understanding of the impact on children of school disruptions over the past nearly 2 years of the pandemic. What toll has the learning loss caused by significant reductions in instructional time and the many myriad challenges posed by the pandemic had on children's progress in reading and in math, and also on their regular attendance in school? The answer to that question can form the foundation for our efforts and response as we work to advance equitable learning recovery throughout this coming year. In today's session, we will examine some recently released research and data that can help us set that foundation. Data that show how the pandemic has exacerbated and widened long-standing historical inequities. And while we take stock of these challenging realities, we will also look for rays of hope, seeking to identify insights about how to support schools and districts in ensuring that the students most affected by the pandemic receive the supports that they need to succeed. And to begin that conversation, I am incredibly honored to welcome and introduce our panel for today. Joining us to moderate today's conversation is Hedy Chang. Hedy is a longtime close partner of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, serving as the president of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student attendance and closing equity gaps by addressing chronic absence. Hedy has spent more than 3 decades working in the fields of family support, family economic success, education, and child development. Welcome, Hedy. We're also delighted to have 3 researchers join us today to share their data, the data that they've been collecting to understand the impact of the pandemic on children's learning. First is Emma Dorn. Emma is the Global Education Practice Manager at McKinsey & Company. She supports McKinsey's education work across early childhood, schools, vocational training, and higher education. She's authored a series of reports tracking the impact of COVID-19 on children's learning and progress, and has joined us a few times previously over the past couple of years to share those findings. Welcome also to Kristen Huff, who has also joined us previously to share her earlier installments of her research. Kristen serves as the Vice President of Assessment and Research at Curriculum Associates, where she leads a team of assessment designers, psychometricians, and researchers in the development of online assessments integrated with personalized learning and whole class instruction. I'd also like to welcome Karyn Lewis. Karyn is a senior research scientist with the Center for School and Student Progress at NWEA, where she co-leads a team of researchers in examining how the pandemic has impacted students' achievement and growth. After we explore the data compiled by these researchers, they will be joined in conversation with our commentators about the implications of this data on our work to mitigate gaps in educational opportunities. So for that portion, I'd like to welcome Denise Forte, who actually moderated the data conversation at the beginning of 2021. We're delighted to have her back in this new role today. Denise is the interim CEO at the Education Trust, providing strategic leadership to the organization's efforts to engage policymakers and diverse coalitions of advocates in demanding and securing equity advancing policy change at the national and state levels. She also leads EdTrust's legislative efforts and coordinates an organization-wide advocacy agenda and strategy. Welcome also to Cecilia Leong. Cecilia is the Vice President of Programs at Attendance Works, where she works to expand the technical assistance resources available to communities across the country, delivering professional development through webinars and online learning modules to help state and local leaders reduce chronic absence. Welcome to all of you. We so appreciate you joining us for today's conversation to share your research and your expertise with our network. Over to you now, Hedy.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for hosting this session today. So I am going to start by asking Kristen to tell us about what you learned about data. What did you find about the impact of the pandemic and COVID-19 on academics? Can you start by giving a sense of what you saw overall and who you saw was most affected? And Kristen, I think you're still muted. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. After a long weekend, everything I know about Zoom, gone. Thank you, Hedy. Yes, my name is Kristen. I will be here, Hedy, sharing with you data from the iReady assessment. The iReady assessment is a K-12 computer adaptive assessment in math and reading. In the analyses I'll be sharing today, we focus only on grades 1 through 8 because that's where we have the most students. Next slide. First of all, I'm going to go over these at a pretty high level. We have a full report and other research reports on our websites. I encourage you to go there for details. In brief, although we tested close to 10 million students this past fall, we sampled down to make sure that the claims we are making about comparisons to historical trend are strongly supported by the data. So for these analyses that I'm getting ready to share with you, we have just under 3 million students in reading and just over 3 million students in mathematics. So it's still a pretty robust sample. Moving on. For these graphs, if you move on, great, thank you. For these graphs, the gray bars, Hedy, represent historical trends in terms of the percent of students performing on grade level. When we say on grade level, what do we mean? We mean students whose knowledge and skills are in line with college and career-ready grade level expectations. These are not norm referenced or grade level equivalents, but rather based on how students' knowledge and skills, as evidenced in the diagnostic assessment, line up with grade level learning standards. We go into more detail on this in the report. Anyway, back to the graph. The gray bars are historical averages of the percent of students on grade level, and the green bars are data from this past fall of 2021. What we see here, for example, is that we have 6% fewer grade 2 students on grade level in reading. The greatest declines are in the early elementary grades, where students are learning to read through mastering foundational skills such as phonemic awareness. So this is pretty not good news, right? The students are not back to where they have been with historical trends. You'll also notice these are fall data. We talk a bit about this in the report. We don't necessarily expect students to be on grade level in the fall when they're first starting school, but if you just compare it to historical trends, that gives you a sense of where we are today versus pre-pandemic. Next slide. These data are mathematics. Here we see the decreases are more widespread and larger than what we see in the reading data. And the biggest decreases are in the upper elementary grades and the middle school grades. This is when students are moving from procedural skills to more conceptual mathematical problem solving. So again, this could be very challenging if we don't get these students back up to grade level in the years to come. Moving on, now we're going to look at the other end of the performance distribution. In these graphs, the gray bars still represent historical data. The red bars, however, represent students who are 2 or more grade levels below. That's right, they're starting in the fall, 2 or more grade levels below. Here in reading, we are seeing the greatest increase in the percentage of students 2 or more grade levels below, again, in grade 2. This is when students are learning to read. So as you can imagine, there are serious implications, Hedy, for classrooms and the school and the district and at home with family when we see this large increase in the number of students needing intensive intervention. Let's move on to math. In math, the differences are, again, larger than in reading. For example, from grades 2 through 6, we see a 10% increase in the number of students who are starting this past fall 2 or more grade levels behind. Let's move on to some disaggregated data. Okay. This first graph is the data disaggregated by the average income in the community. The gray bars, again, are historical data, and the green bars are the percentage of students who are on grade level, with reading on the left and mathematics on the right. We see here that in each case, in each income bracket, there are fewer students on grade level this fall, and this mirrors and exacerbates pre-pandemic inequalities that show lower income communities having fewer students on grade level. We see that trend continue and worsen in each case.
And Kristen, I was just seeing a question in the chat. Can you clarify again? The question is this from national assessments? And if so, which assessments?
This is from a national, the iReady assessment is used by about a quarter of K-8 students nationwide. We reduced the sample. I looked in the Q&A. We reduced the sample by millions of students. We go in detail in the report because we needed to make sure that the comparisons with historical data where we matched students and we made sure we had enough longitudinal data. So we go into some detail with this in the report. Nonetheless, the resulting sample is still very robust.
Thank you, Kristen.
Great. I'm moving on to the next slide. Again, looking at the other end of the distribution, where we see the percent of students 2 or more grade levels below increases across the board, meaning across the 3 different income brackets, and again, mirroring and exacerbating historical inequalities by community income level. Just 2 more graphs, the same kind of pattern, if you can move on. This graph and the next graph, though, are perhaps our most disturbing. These are data disaggregated by the proportion of students in schools who are either Black, Latino, or white. Again, the historical inequities are reflected in these fall data, where students with majority Black and Latino students have fewer students on grade level than their counterparts in majority white schools. And if you go on to the next slide, here we show the percent increase in students who are 2 or more grade levels below, which again mirrors and exacerbates historical inequalities for these underserved schools and underserved communities. In closing, through today's recovery efforts, if you move on to the last slide, in today's recovery efforts and increased attention to the education sector, we do believe that we have an opportunity to recalibrate our existing systems and turn this into a transformational moment. We know that educators and parents remain committed to providing learning opportunities and supports for all students. And we believe that with rigorous data paired with differential instructional techniques, supportive professional development, and harnessing these funds for innovative learning intervention, we can turn the tide to make learning more equitable for all students. And I encourage you to read the full reports.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for sharing this troubling but really important data for us to see. I wanted to explain to folks, we are actually going to have a couple more of our research join us. We'll go from Kristen and Karyn. Heads up, you're up next. And what we'll be doing is actually adding information from different sources. So you can see how the findings that Kristen are shared are supported or reflected in other findings, and some of the questions that people are asking in the chat. Is it for high school students? What age group? You know, that will be actually responded to by the full complement of researchers that we have here today. And then after we really get a handle on the research, we're going to turn to questions about what does this mean? How can we make a difference? What are the strategies that means for our schools and our communities? So with that, Karyn, can you join us? Thank you so much, Kristen. She's going to be around. We're not done yet. We're just going to go round robin for a bit. Tell us a little bit about your research and what you found and how that confirms or if anything's different from what we just saw now.
Sure. Thanks, Hedy, and good morning, or I guess good afternoon for many of you. It's great to be with you today. I'm Karyn Lewis. I am a senior research scientist at NWEA. We go on to the next slide. Our COVID agenda at NWEA has been an ongoing one since the onset of the pandemic, unfortunately. What we're finding largely is really consistent with what Kristen has just reported and shared with you all. At the beginning of the 2020 school year, we saw reading achievement that was roughly consistent with historical averages, but we did find evidence of impacts in math. However, over the course of the 2020-21 school year, we saw that the pandemic was taking a toll on reading achievement as well. And by the end of last school year, we found relative declines in both reading and math, although the toll has been greater in math. We also, similar to what Kristen has just shared, find similar patterns of inequities, widening, and uneven impacts. And the largest declines we see in our data are for students of color and students in high poverty schools, particularly amongst the youngest grades that we've studied, which spans the upper elementary period. Our latest brief that we just released in December examines achievement at the start of the 21-22 school year, and we continue to see significant levels of unfinished learning. The one bright spot when we look at achievement is that the relative declines we see this fall, relative to historic averages that is, are roughly consistent with what we reported at the end of the last school year. So in other words, we haven't seen any additional accumulation of unfinished learning over the last few months, which may suggest things are starting to level off. Next slide, please. The findings from our latest brief that I want to emphasize this morning look at growth over the pandemic period thus far. And I think these are an important complement to the kinds of achievement findings that Kristen has just shared. Questions about achievement provide really important information on where students are at in this moment. Questions about growth can provide insight into how they got there. So the portion of analyses from our most recent report that I want to share look at gains across the pandemic period for the group of students we were able to track longitudinally from fall of 2019 to fall of 2021. Next slide, please. So our assessment is the NWEA map growth assessment, and we have provided with our assessment a full complement of achievement and growth norms. And I want to focus in on our growth norms for a minute. What growth norms do is situate test score gains across a time period relative to pre-pandemic averages for growth. And in this analysis, we look at skip year growth, or growth across 2 years. So for instance, following a group of students from the fall of 3rd grade to the fall of 5th grade. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you some skip year conditional growth percentiles for both math and reading. In this bar chart, the key point of comparison to keep in mind is the 50th percentile, which is marked here by a dashed line. And you can interpret the 50th percentile to tell us that the observed growth, or the growth that we've seen, is consistent with projected growth based on those pre-pandemic averages. Next slide, please. So here we're looking first in reading, and I'm showing you median conditional growth percentiles for the students in our sample that we followed longitudinally. What we see here is that in reading, skip year growth fell below pre-pandemic national averages, again denoted by that dashed line, but not that dramatically in reading, which is more notable if we go to the next slide, and you can compare what's happening in reading with what's happening in math. And here we see some more notable differences. So for instance, for students, if we focus on the far left side of this graph, following students from 3rd to 5th grade, we see that in math, students were at roughly the 37th conditional growth percentile, which is 13 percentile points below pre-pandemic averages for growth in math across this span. Compare that with reading, where students are at the 47th percentile, falling only 3 percentile points below pre-pandemic averages. Next slide, please. So lastly, I want to share one novel question that our research addressed that provides some additional insight into which students have been most impacted by the pandemic. And here we ask whether gains over the pandemic period differed depending on pre-pandemic achievement status. So in other words, did growth across the pandemic matter depending on how students started out? Do we see evidence that low and high achievers are faring differently? Next slide, please. To address this question, we first start by looking back to students' pre-pandemic achievements, so where they were at in the fall of 2019. And we take that distribution of achievement and we split it out into quintile bins. So the first quintile bin is the lowest achieving students who are ranging from the 1st to the 20th percentile. The second quintile bin, Q2, will include students from the 21st to 40th percentile, and so on. We're then going to compare normative growth across the pandemic, across these groups, to understand whether students differed. Next slide, please. So again, the important point of comparison here is the 50th percentile, which denotes that observed growth was consistent with projected growth based on pre-pandemic averages. If it didn't matter where students started out in terms of their achievement, what we'd expect to see here is a flat pattern, that we see similar normative growth trends across all of those different pre-pandemic achievement bins. Next slide, please. However, that is not what we find. We instead see this pretty notable stair-step pattern. So how we interpret this is that we see here students that were lower achieving were lagging further behind their projected growth compared to high achieving students. Next slide, please. We can zoom out now to look across all of the grades in our study, and we see this similar stair-step trend across grades. This is important because growth at roughly the 50th percentile is necessary to maintain achievement status over time. So what this stair-step pattern tells us is that high achievers were more likely to maintain that high achieving status, whereas lower achievers were more likely to show declines. So this is an additional way that pre-existing achievement gaps that were already there prior to the pandemic have only been widened across the last 2 years.
Karyn, if I'm reading this correctly, is it even saying that the highest achieving kids, actually, some of them were doing better?
Exactly, Hedy.
Pre-pandemic?
Exactly. They were either at pre-pandemic averages or slightly above in that highest achieving group. Next slide, please. So here we're sitting next to those reading results, what's happening in math. Here too, we see a similar stair-step trend across grades. But unlike in reading, we see that across all the entire achievement spectrum, we see that all students are falling below those historic national averages. The implications, of course, for lower CGPs are more significant for lower achievers, but this is still concerning because it suggests a collective step backward for all students in math and further underscores the urgent need to support math development. So in sum, this is one additional place where we see pre-existing gaps have widened. When we look at the same kinds of disaggregations that Kristen has included, we see similar trends where students of color and students in high poverty schools have been most hard hit. But I think this is an important consideration as well of an additional place we need to be targeting extra resources to make sure we're supporting kids and getting them back on track.
Thank you so much, Karyn. And now I'd like to ask Emma Dorn from McKinsey to join us. Emma, can you tell us what you would add given your research? What would you add to this picture?
Oh, well, hi, everyone. I'm Emma Dorn from McKinsey. Really honored to be here. So we also have been doing work on the impact of the pandemic on student learning, really since the pandemic began in 2020. And a lot of our results just mirror exactly what Karyn and Kristen have shared, especially on the K-8 side. So I'm not going to go over the K-8 results just because I don't want to be repetitive. Instead, I want to add a few things in addition that we found. I saw a question in the chat on high school, for example. Now, on high school, it's been harder to get information. The state standardized tests weren't done in all states due to the pandemic still being ongoing. And even in the states that did run standardized tests, participation rates were lower than they have been historically. And a hypothesis is that the students who were most likely not to participate were probably the ones who actually were most impacted. That said, what we were able to do is we looked at the states which had the highest participation rates in spring standardized tests in 2021 and compared the results there to historical data in 2019. And what we found is you can see that pretty much in every state, there was a drop. And the drop was about an average of a 5 percentage point drop in math and about a 3 percentage point drop in ELA, which across the board is pretty similar to the results that Kristen shared in terms of achievement for elementary. So I think the high level here is we don't know for sure what's happening at high school. We don't have the same granularity of data because some of these great formative assessments like NWEA and curriculum associates aren't done at the high school level, but the data that we do have suggests that the problem is severe there as well. The other additional source of data that we added was we did a parent survey, actually twice, once in the spring and once in the fall, of over 15,000 parents in all 50 states. To try to get a sense of how might this be different across states. Because again, because the state standardized tests weren't run in every state, it's really hard to get a sense of how this is different across the country. So if you go to the next slide, you could take a look at the x-axis here is the percent of parents who believe that their child has fallen behind where they would have been absent the pandemic. And on the x-axis here is the Burbio Index of Access to In-Person Learning. So the higher you go up, the more access students have to in-person learning. And the lower you go down, like California, Washington, DC, Oregon, Washington, less access. And you can see it's a little bit all over the map. There is a little bit of a relationship there between the more access to in-person learning, the fewer parents believe the student has fallen behind, but there's also outliers on either side. And I think what this just says is this is a problem for every state, but there may be some states who have particularly big challenges to overcome. The other thing we wanted to look at is, well, at a student level, can we say anything about what the impact of modality of learning was on the impact of the pandemic? And if you go to the next slide, what we found here, and we asked parents here again. So again, this is an imperfect measure, it's parent perceptions, but it's the best we can do at this point. What was the modality of your child over the previous year? And you can see here that students who are fully remote or in virtual learning all year, more of those parents were likely to say that their child had fallen behind, 43%, versus parents of students who are in person all year, only 28% of those parents thought that their child had fallen behind. And in fact, the later the students came back to school, the more parents reported that they believed their child had fallen behind. There's obviously information here as well that from other assessments, there was some really great research done in Ohio that used assessment results and came out with similar results to this. The other thing we wanted to look at is do we think it's getting better or worse? And I think this is something that Karyn also suggested, and I think there is a little bit of a bright spot here. So if you go to the next slide, we ask parents pre-pandemic, how worried were you about various things, your child's academic performance, your child's engagement or attendance, and your child's mental health, because it's really important to remember here, assessment results can tell us about math and English, but there's a whole bunch of other things that have been happening in these students' lives, both other subjects, their physical health, their mental health. And what we can see here is the black lines here are the pre-pandemic numbers. The blue lines were what parents reported in the spring of 2021, and then the light blue lines are in the fall of 2021. And so across all three metrics, academic performance, engagement, and mental health, there was a big jump in parents who were concerned between pre-pandemic and the spring, but that improved a little bit. It's still much worse than pre-pandemic, but it's improved between the spring and the fall. So fewer parents now are concerned than they were in the spring, which suggests that some of the mitigation efforts are beginning to maybe work a little bit. Though, of course, one caveat, this was before the latest variant. And so we probably need to do another one of these surveys at some point. The other point, just to, again, back up a lot of what Karyn and Kristen were saying, is that there were some disparities here. And so Black and Hispanic parents were more likely to be worried across the board about their students' academic performance, engagement, and mental health, which again, just makes us remember how important it's going to be to target some of the resources towards those students who actually need them most. So I'll take a pause here and back to Hedy, because I think she has some additional questions.
Thank you, Emma. So we also really appreciated that McKinsey was able to use its data to also look at closures and attendance. So we're going to shift for a moment from the achievement data to taking a look at your what you learned, what happened in terms of student attendance, both given school closures, and what you found out about chronic absence.
Of course. So, I mean, the one thing to remember is the disruptions aren't over yet. So if we skip a couple of slides ahead to this one, this was before Omicron. And even for Omicron, there was continued disruptions to schools. And obviously 2022 has not started well in that sense. And so there are a number of students who have continued to have closures of schools, either of whole districts or of specific schools or specific grades. And in addition to that, there are also students who are quarantined themselves individually, even though their school might not be closed. And all of those disruptions are having a continued impact on learning. So if you pop to the next page, we asked parents how much of their schooling so far has been disrupted.
Emma, can you just do me a favor? When you say you asked parents, what was the timing of this? So people can just have
this was in November. So this was before the latest variant. So bear in mind that this is probably looking worse now. Well, would be looking worse now if we asked again. So this is in November. We said of the school year so far, first of all, how are you choosing to have your child in school? And so there are a subset of parents who have actually made choices to be in homeschool, virtual school, or hybrid models. But about 70% of parents opted for fully in-person learning. They wanted their kid to be in school every day. And of those students, about 17% experienced a disruption. And you can see here that a high percentage of those were experiencing meaningful disruptions, like over a week of disruptions. 10 days, that's 2 weeks. And so of the students who had opted to be in person, a really meaningful number are continuing to experience disruption. And those increased disruptions aren't evenly spread. And if you hop to the next page, you can see that parents of Black and Hispanic students were most likely to report that their student had experienced a disruption to learning. So here, about 20% of those Black parents parents of Black students who had opted for fully in person said, yeah, our child has experienced disruptions, versus maybe 13% of Asian. And you can see that there's a variety of reasons here. Sometimes it was the whole campus had closed, but also often it was individual students being quarantined or being sick or other reasons. And so then linking that back to the question, Hedy, that you originally asked, which was, well, what does this all mean for chronic absenteeism? I think one of the big concerns that we have is that a lot of the data that's coming out is about the subset of students that actually are attending. And that we may be missing a whole subset of students that have just stopped attending school, either in whole or in part. And that it's going to be really important not just to focus on recovering learning, but also actually re-engaging students. And the data from the parent survey here is particularly worrying. And so if you hop to the next page, we asked parents pre-pandemic, did your student, how much school did your student miss in a year? Was it 15 or more days? Was it 10 to 15 days? Was it no days at all? How many days on average? And prior to the pandemic, about 8% of parents said that their student missed 15 or more days. So these are the black lines here. And low-income parents prior to the pandemic were slightly more likely to say, yes, my student is missing more than 15 days in a full year, which is one of the definitions of chronic absenteeism. We asked that question again in the spring. Again, that's the dark blue line. And then in the fall, which is the light blue line. And what's really worrying here is not only did it go up during the pandemic, it kept getting worse in the fall. So this is one metric, unlike some of the others, where it keeps getting worse. And there are some reasons for that. You know, perhaps it was less visible when kids were all online, that kids were skipping school, versus when they're actually there in person. But remember, this is parent perception. So it's not a specific legal definition, or it's not what the school has logged. It's not just that the kid, you know, logged in, then turned their camera off and were counted. It's actually what parents would believed was happening. The other thing that's really worrying about this is that for low-income students, it's continuing to get much worse, but actually high-income students have begun to recover. And so if you actually go to the next slide and you break out that high-income bucket further, and I know this slide is a little busy, but maybe the numbers on the left-hand side are the same, but maybe just look here. For the students at the highest income level, pre-pandemic, there was fairly low rates of chronic absenteeism reported. It hopped up just like in any other of the income levels, but it's actually begun to recover significantly versus those at the lower levels that are continuing to get worse. So again, trying to focus on those students who really need the help to get back re-engaged. Finally, we did actually also cut this by demographic, by race and ethnicity. The patterns here are a little harder to see, but certainly American Indian and Alaska Natives, fairly high levels of chronic absenteeism before the pandemic, but really catapulted to 28% of parents of American Indian or Alaska Native students reporting that their child is possibly on track to be chronically absent this school year. And then we looked also at the data by grade. If you hop to the next slide, a little bit unclear what the patterns are here. I think the main takeaway from this is it's kind of bad everywhere. It's not like this is a problem of a specific grade level. This is a problem across the board. There is some other data, and Hedy can speak to it much better than I can, which suggests the transition into high school is a particularly problematic transition, and that students are maybe particularly chronically absent coming out of the pandemic in that area. But really concern across the board. And then finally, we also looked at the data, and we'll be sending these slides around, but I don't want to linger too long. I want to get to the discussion. We also had a look by state, and here again, slightly perplexing, the data. You know, if you think about the learning data, was pretty highly correlated with how long kids were out of school. Actually not the case with the attendance data, which suggests there may be a whole bunch of other factors coming into play, not just the amount of time in remote learning, but also the supports provided, maybe mitigation efforts to get students re-enrolled. And also the reality that even for students who were in school, the pandemic had a huge impact on mental health, on connectivity, on anxiety. And so maybe there isn't as close a correlation between the modality of learning and absenteeism as there is on the actual academic side.
And Emma, and as with other data, it also might be interesting to compare this to pre-pandemic patterns. Some of
Yes.
this is similar and some of this is different.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that really insightful set of information that called attention to the work beyond academics. Why don't we stop showing slides for a second, because I think they're over. And I want to actually ask both Kristen and Karyn, maybe starting with Karyn, do you have any other data that you were able to collect at looking at student engagement and attendance? And then I'll turn to Kristen to see if you have any other information to add to this.
Sure. So Emma's data is much more nuanced than what I can share with the group, but we, as a proxy for attendance, we look at attrition from testing. So looking at the kids that tested in the prior year, how many of them showed back up and tested again in the current year, and using that as a proxy to understand the kids who went missing from testing. We can't say whether that's because they disenrolled from school altogether or were missing the day that the test was administered, but we can say something about who was more likely to go missing. And what we see is that attrition overall from testing has been much higher during the pandemic relative to typical levels of attrition that we see. But we also find that it's not a random group of kids. It tends to be students of color, students that were lower achieving in prior years, students in higher poverty schools. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind, not just because it's concerning that those kids are not engaging with assessments and maybe disengaged from school altogether, but it also puts a pretty big asterisk on the results that we report here, that the exact groups that we're finding the largest impacts amongst are also those that are more likely to be missing from our assessment data. So that means that we might actually be reporting a best case scenario because we are capturing some of those really critical voices. So I think it's really important to consider, because we have an incomplete picture of what's happening for students across the country, we may actually be underestimating the impacts of the pandemic.
Thank you. Kristen, anything to add to this?
Yeah, just a plug for some of the research we have on that website regarding testing location and digital divide, what we call the digital divide patterns that we observed. Like Karyn, we have to use testing location as a proxy I mean, Karyn, you didn't say you use testing location, but you're using your testing data as a proxy. So in the same sense, we're using our testing data as a proxy. We did not see significant increases in testing attrition, but we did see a lot of students who were testing in school versus out of school. And what we did see were changes in patterns in their uses of the online learning. And we make some generalizations from there that are related to attrition, but not directly, because we just don't have those data. So I would encourage people who are interested in this topic to see the research we have online.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to give Denise Forte a heads up. I'm about to turn to you in just a second. In the meantime, I want to invite Kristen and Karyn and Emma. There are some questions in the Q&A. Do you have Haitian Creole data? You know, how is the connection between math and reading connected? If you might respond to some of those data questions about the nature of data or the connection to dropout, that would be great. And in the meantime, I actually want to shift us over to talking about what are the implications for all of this. So Denise, so appreciative to have you here. You know, so clearly we are seeing that everyone was affected by COVID-19, and that has already been shown today. And we are also seeing extraordinary disproportionality, so that historically underserved students, notably students of color and students in economically disadvantaged families, were even more affected. And yet we're at a particular moment in time. There is increased recognition of the longstanding inequities. There is also unprecedented levels of education funding available. Lots of it's federal. In a few states, like the state where I live in California, we also got some state and local resources to add to that. So how do we use this moment to mitigate these gaps?
Hedy, thank you so much for that question. And like all of us who are listening today and viewing the powerful information that was shared by Kristen, Karyn, and Emma, I mean, how could we not be just disturbed by these numbers? And when you think about, I have 2 children in grade school, and I'm also on my local PTA, speak often with the principals and the teachers. The day-to-day is still very harrowing. So these numbers, you know, reflect, I think, like the top of the iceberg. And when you get down below it, they're children every day, teachers every day, school leaders every day are having to make some really tough decisions to make sure that not only are they balancing the needs of our kiddos, our young people, and their mental health and their physical health, but also how do we keep a focus on learning and on academic achievement when we know, look, someday we're going to have kids graduating, going to college or getting jobs, and they need to have this important foundation. So you know, the Education Trust, as you said earlier, we've been struggling with these numbers ourselves as working across the country with advocates. What do we do? And that's what our advocates are asking. What advocates and policymakers like, what do we need to do? And I was so glad to see in the chat, and also a couple of organizations who are on this webinar today, talk about the importance of how we build strong relationships with young people. Our research that we did when we were looking at how do we address unfinished learning with evidence-based models to achieve the outcomes that we want for our students, how do we ensure that at this time in particular, they have strong, reliable relationships around them so that we could be supporting their mental health. As someone pointed out, that could be from an out of school time program, but it could also be from a community-based program that is much closer to the students that we're most concerned about. We think it's particularly important right now because the economic toll of the pandemic, the health toll, food and housing insecurities, losing family members to COVID, strong and supportive relationships are going to be critical to addressing these months of stress and missed classroom instruction so that our kids can have the time, the tools, and the time to get back to whatever our new normal should be. And as you also said, with this increased federal investment, and I'm excited that Governor Newsom has invested some of the state's own dollars, and I think other places are trying to do that. Tennessee, Colorado, Maryland, you know, having them use these new dollars to accelerate, not just remediate, but accelerate student learning by spending these recovery funds on targeted intensive tutoring or high dosage in tutoring. We know that high expectations for students make a big difference. And we know that at the same time, remediation has been shown to be most often used for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. It's been shown to be least effective. I saw proventutoring.org on here. I'm so glad that you all are continuing Bob Sleevan's amazing work in this area. We know that intensive tutoring, when implemented well, can help underserved students catch up and meet those high expectations. And there are some key elements that are also really important to delivering on the outcomes. Have a tutor with experience and ongoing pre-service training. Doesn't mean they all need to be qualified teachers. In fact, the Education Trust released a report earlier this year about, late last year, about the impact of using after-school providers and getting them into the pipeline of teachers because they too know the students really well. We also know working on math and reading curriculums that are aligned with what the students are learning during the day, extended tutoring over the entire school year, small tutor ratios, maintaining the same tutor at the same time for the entire year. Those are the things that are driving the outcomes. And then someone also talked about expanded learning time. That's another evidence-based model. If we can make sure that more kids have access to full learning, whole child experiences during the summer. National Summer Learning Association has great information there. The winter session, or even in-school programs like double blocking. Those are a number of evidence-based models that we know can meet this moment and start to help accelerate learning so that hopefully we can recover and not just go back to pre-pandemic, but get better in the post-pandemic.
Denise, one question for you before I turn to Cecilia. There are comments in the chat about digital resources, digital learning, internet access as a way of addressing some of the uninterrupted learning. Are you also seeing that as a key strategy, even now as we've turned back to a huge emphasis on in-person learning?
So I think there are a few other organizations out there, but are able to speak to that. But look, the digital divide and access to the internet continues to be a real challenge. Some of the good things out there, though, are the increase in accessible dollars for the E-rate for schools, so they can put more devices in schools, can increase access to high-speed internet, can make sure that students have one-to-one in terms of device access. And it seems to me, and again, I'm just right now speaking as a mother, the availability of virtual learning when push comes to shove, as we just saw from the data, parents are choosing in-person learning, but there has to be some contingencies there. And we have to continue to address the digital divide. It's something that we continue to do at the Education Trust at the federal level, because recognition during this pandemic, lack of access, not only meant lack of access to education, but for families as a whole, it was lack of access to workforce development opportunities, lack of access to information on where you can get a vaccine or where you could find testing. So that remains really critical for our families.
Thank you so much, Denise. Cecilia, what would you add into this, particularly from sort of a chronic absence attendance perspective?
Yeah, good morning. And thank you so much for those comments, Denise. I want to build on what Denise was saying. From a chronic absence perspective, we really want to think about why students attend school, what motivates them. And this really is centered on relationship. You hit the nail on the head there, Denise. We have the opportunity to invest vast amounts of funding into what we know works. And it's a pivotal moment where we can really improve those conditions for learning that we know have been eroded during this yo-yoing back and forth, right? Of in school, out of school, quarantine, et cetera. Students are so much more likely to attend school and be engaged when they feel physically and emotionally safe and healthy, when they feel they belong in school, that someone cares about them, and that learning isn't just some treadmill they're going through, but it's engaging, it's wonderful, it's why we want to go to school, right? So, and that we're supported by a caring adult, someone who notices when we're there or not there. So I would suggest that using some of the data that we have, such an abundance of, thanks to our colleagues today, we know which student groups have been hardest hit by the pandemic. We know who's chronically absent. And it's valuable information, particularly the chronic absence pieces, that will guide our investments into these evidence-based practices that Denise was lifting up. We can target our resources. Now, today's data is mostly national. It doesn't get down to certain student groups, but you have your local data. You know, we have a huge audience here. Many of them represent different states, different communities. You have that data pre-pandemic, and some of you have it during the pandemic, to tell you which groups really need those investments and really need those supports to be engaged in school. So I'll leave you one example, since this webinar is called Rays of Hope, right? Or there are supposed to be rays of hope. We really have seen one example out of the state of Connecticut where they invested their ESSER dollars into the LEAP home visiting program. And they specifically chose 15 of the school districts with high levels of chronic absence to have a different way of engaging with students who are most disengaged, to work with communities over time in partnership with community-based organizations, because the state knew that teachers and educators already are stretched thin. So bringing in people who can help connect and keep those relationships going has really been paying off. So that's one example of how you can use those dollars.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And that multiple home visits that began last summer that people could sustain. Cecilia and I've had the privilege of really even hearing success stories, even as late last week, even with the Omicron hitting, we saw those relationships paying off. I would like to turn back to our researchers, Emma, Karyn, Kristen. Tell us, what are you seeing? Are you seeing some real opportunities or rays of hope that help to guide us in this work? Emma?
Hi. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of levels upon which I'm thinking about this. So the first is, what are the evidence-based interventions? And I think that Denise and Cecilia, you mentioned several of these, and they've been pretty well documented. There's high-dosage tutoring, where there's pretty good evidence base from the Saga education model in Chicago of really impressive educational outcomes from that. And there are acceleration academies. There's the whole acceleration approach versus taking a remediation approach, really exposing students to grade level learning and scaffolding them to achieve that learning versus making kids repeat a whole year. And so because of piece one is there's some evidence-based approaches. I think there's some great places where you can find out more about those. The Proven Tutoring site, the National Student Support Accelerator, Attendance Work itself has great works on evidence-based approaches in around absenteeism. Those are all great. The gap that I then see is, how do you implement those at scale? And this is the huge challenge that I think schools, districts, and states have in front of them. Because on the one hand, they now have the funding to do so, but it's not enough to just have an evidence-based approach and funding. Actually translating that into impact at scale on the ground is tremendously challenging, especially at a time when districts are dealing with every day a new crisis, a new disruption, a new variant. And so being able to actually pull together the organizational resources, the human capital resources to deliver these at scale, to me, those are kind of the proof points I'm really looking for, because it's not enough to reach 100 kids with a high-dosage tutoring program. We need to be reaching millions of kids with high-dosage tutoring programs. When we did our initial report, I think we worked out it was around $66 billion to reach all the kids who are going to need it with high-dosage tutoring. We have the $66 billion, but what we don't have is the 2 million tutors that it's going to take to reach all those students. And so how do we think about strategically as a system putting together the resource? The same is true, resources to actually make this happen. The same is true in the mental health space as well. We know there's a huge need for more mental health resources, more building relationships, but there are huge, again, human capital constraints on the number of counselors and social workers available. And so how do we think about some of those ways that we could overcome those at scale? So that's kind of where my brain is going. One example on the tutoring front where I was excited was, again, talking about the rays of hope. Baltimore City Schools really took an approach where they were really thinking about how do we scale this up and not just reach a few students, but reach all the students that need help. They're still in progress. We're all a work in progress, but I think they've done some really interesting things. The first is that they partnered with multiple different partners. So they bet on multiple different horses to try and reach as many students as possible. Some of the partnerships, they partnered with Amplify to provide virtual reading tutoring services to some K-12 students. where teachers identify students who can benefit from tutoring. And they do this virtual tutoring 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And they're really beginning to get results out of some of that. And again, so maybe using virtual in a one-on-one way can be more effective than trying to use it with a whole classroom. I think another example, they also partnered with Johns Hopkins University to offer tutoring services. And then they also partnered with local HBCUs to ensure that their tutors were actually reflective of the lived experience of their students. And so being able to partner with all of these different partners and bring in new folks, for example, from the HBCUs, college students from HBCUs, they were able to scale up perhaps more quickly than some other districts were able to do so.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'd actually like to turn to Kristen for a second. Kristen, I know you have asked the grade level reading campaign team to pull up her data slide, because you also have started to talk about a ray of hope given even the data that we have. So could we see that? And then Kristen, tell us why you see this as a ray of hope for us.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I want to underscore everything we've heard from the folks so far about the interventions that we need to be funding through ESSER and make sure that they are research-based and scalable. So I was glad to hear those terms used many times in their comments. I wanted to just bring us back to the data for a bit. We have a couple of graphs here. This is for growth for 2nd grade through 3rd grade for reading and mathematics. The dotted line is historical data. The blue line is during the pandemic. And what we, the dotted line is what we would expect to see in the same time period based on historical data. And the blue line is what we did see. And the lines at the top are students who are in higher grade level placements. These are typically students from low poverty, more white communities. And then the second set of information is from high poverty communities. And yes, we can talk about the historical disparities that persist. But what I want to show in terms of a ray of hope is that even for our most underserved communities, we see that line going in the right direction since the pandemic has started. So we did see learning loss, but as the pandemic has progressed, as we are getting more services to students, either through narrowing the digital divide or getting them back in school, we do see students are learning. Students are learning, even our most underserved students. So I just, as we poise ourselves for our next question, Hedy, I just wanted to reground ourselves in the data that is very, disturbing because of the inequities and the loss, but that trend is going in the right direction. And that's what I wanted to share as a ray of hope.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna keep us going. Let's stop sharing. First of all, I want to call attention also to the chat where there are a number of folks writing in about examples from their own communities about things that they're trying or things that are moving to scale. And I'm actually going to shift to the next question because we're, and then we'll move it into more general parts. But Cecilia, where are you seeing some examples? I know you already did a state, maybe think about a local example where we have an opportunity to learn from what's happening on the ground in communities. Are you seeing any of that? And what are ways we can gather and look at that information?
Yeah, well, there are definitely bright spots. And that's one of the great things actually about being connected with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading is you always get to hear about bright spots. I would lift up Sacramento, California today. Prior to the pandemic, Sac City schools were already building a really different system to address chronic absence and the historical inequities. They were taking a data-driven approach using chronic absence data to build school teams, to respond in non-punitive ways to absences, and they focused on evidence-based practices. They changed the tone and content of how they talked with families. They engaged youth and youth voice in creating messages, and they worked with behavioral scientists to communicate more effectively. And since the pandemic, the district's really taken their ESSER funds and the recovery funds to expand those evidence-based practices. I love what Emma said about scaling. One of the things they did immediately was they said, look, we've always wanted to do relational home visits. They love that particular model, and they've always been constrained by budget. So once they got the money, they said, anyone who wants to train and do home visits, and they can now do virtual as well as in person, can do it. So they're building that capacity in-house using their funds. They're investing in community schools. They're expanding high quality summer learning opportunities. They're hiring young people. There's a twofer for you, right? In order to both be part of the summer learning and to give them a reason to stay in school and income, so they don't have to, skip school to take that second job or whatever it is. So I think it's a great example of how you leverage funds to support innovation, and they were already heading that way to begin with. I have to discipline myself not to go on and on about them.
I think we may have
lose
lost
Hedy?
Hedy, but I think we can continue the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, look what happened. Hedy predicted it.
Yeah, I thought, why was she giving me such a blank look?
Sarah, can I jump in? One of the things that I really struck me, and I'm so glad Emma brought it up, and everybody should come back on camera. The point about sustainability and infrastructure, I don't think that can be underestimated. And we have really been, someone in the chat said, the ESSER funding and the ARP funding is time limited. So we should be using those time limited funds for those one-time purchases or short-term purchases that could actually be helpful in building an infrastructure. PD programming, computers for sure, if you want to do some sort of virtual activity. How do you make and start building the capacity of the folks around you in your community? Is there a way that you could take those dollars and help build capacity with some of the wraparound services in your community? So there are definite ways that we should be talking about sustainability. And at the same time, I know Cecilia mentioned Baltimore, Emma mentioned Baltimore City, but I just want to shout out some of the work that's going on in Louisiana with tutoring, in Tennessee with tutoring, and these are states as well. Baltimore City was going to be an example I used to, that have been able to think about what is necessary to build a really community-led type of operation that takes into consideration what the students and their families need.
Denise, one of the things that Hedy and I have been kicking around is with the high intensity tutoring, can you braid together that model with the success mentor model so that you're doing two things at once, right? You're really providing the academic support and enrichment and the relationship and encouragement to attend regularly. So there are many ways in which we can think, a bit more holistically ourselves. We don't have to live in silos forever.
Right. I think that's right. And whoever mentioned incentivizing mentors and tutors, what a brilliant idea to, really think about either how you build a pipeline so that these current mentors, current tutors find a real career in that, or you are helping them do the, go to school and stay in school because you're providing them a little additional cash. So I'd love to whoever put that idea in the chat.
And folks, this is Hedy, who had a minor power outage over at her house. So I'm now back, but I can't see any questions. So Sarah, I'm going to allow you to continue helping to facilitate until I can eventually gain access.
Okay, wonderful. Were we talking about digital equity and digital access earlier? It seems as though it's a challenge for all of us. Let's see, we've gotten a lot of questions coming in, and actually, well, before we turn to Q&A, just wanted to make sure that the panelists had a chance to fully address that second question that Hedy had asked everyone about the opportunity to learn from communities and states that are bucking these trends. Karyn, did you have something that you wanted to add to that as well?
Sure, I don't have data to speak to it just yet, but I wanted to underscore a large research project our team has taken on in collaboration with researchers at the American Institute for Research, as well as at Harvard Center for Education Policy Research, where we're partnering with districts that use the NWEA map growth assessment and are also using their ESSER funds to implement various COVID recovery projects. And we're trying to get them back information in real time as quickly as we can to help them understand which programs and interventions are working more or less effectively. I hate the phrase, don't let a good crisis go to waste, but I think it really applies right now because, as Emma has pointed out, it's all about implementation. And even if there is an evidence base for a particular program, we need to be very mindful of how it works on the ground, who it works for, and under what conditions. And I think this is a moment when we really need to be paying very close attention to the data to show us how our interventions are working, for whom they're working, and make decisions based on that efficacy. And I think this is a moment where we really need to think hard about failing fast. And to the extent that programs and services aren't working, let's make sure we're paying attention to that and not just hoping it'll get better, but targeting our dollars and efforts to where they actually are having the most impact. So I don't have data to speak to that yet, but I hope that by the summer, we can start to paint a broader picture of not only what's happening in the districts we're working with, but also what seems to be working well.
We'll have to have you back to share that data when you have it in the summer. Kristen, would you like to add something?
Just briefly that, we are also mining our data to identify those schools and districts who are making strong gains despite the challenges of the pandemic, and really trying to, once we identify them, dig in and find out, what are you doing? What's working in your community? And we're going to start publishing a series of case studies. In fact, we just had one come out in the last day or so from Georgetown County School District in South Carolina, where despite the challenges of the pandemic, they have been able to move a significant portion of their students from needing tier 2 intervention to tier 1 in reading. And I do encourage you to read the full report. In short, though, they credit having very detailed data on each student to highlight where the student needs to grow, but also what the student's strengths are and assets are, so that they can build upon those strengths and assets to close the gap. They also have a strong theory of action around accelerating learning through targeting specific strategies that help students scaffold to grade level work as soon as feasible. And their theory of action also includes engaging the student learner as an agent in his or her learning path. So anyway, I encourage you to read the report, but these are the information that we're trying to find out what's working in different kinds of communities and get it out there for people. So thank you for asking.
Thanks. And I just posted a link to that case study report in the chat box so folks can access it. Emma, is there anything that you would want to add?
No, I think I added mostly. I guess my only other thing is there are a bunch of other bright spots coming up across the country. And one of the things I think, just to build on what Karyn was saying is, right now we don't quite know what a best practice is. We just know an example practice because we don't have all the data. And so forums like this are particularly important to share what we're hearing. I know Chiefs for Change is trying to put together COVID resources with examples of best practices. Other organizations that are sharing, because the normal peer review process is just too slow to deal with this pace of changes that are happening. And so these kinds of forums where we're just sharing in the chat what we're hearing, I think is tremendously useful.
Great, good point. Hedy, I see that you've come back. I know you're probably catching up. So I was just going to ask one of the questions, or kind of a couple of questions have come in the Q&A box while we've been talking, looking at rural versus urban challenges, and in particular, like challenges around rural issues in terms of digital access, kind of that last mile connectivity issues, and rural areas lacking infrastructure around personnel and human resources to deliver tutoring programs. So can any of you share either information from your data that looks at kind of the rural urban issues, or any insights about rural, or examples where you've seen rural communities, kind of addressing these challenges in that geographical area? And then I'll pass it back to you, Hedy.
I think from my side, our data wasn't able to look at that. Interestingly, where I've seen this most, so my role, I spend about half my time in the US, and I spend half my time doing global K-12 for globally. And that rural-urban divide, we think it's bad here. If you look at many of the low and middle income countries around the world, it's in spades. And there actually is data coming from, I believe it's Ethiopia, where students in urban areas were losing learning, but not nearly as quickly, and students in rural areas really weren't learning at all. So it's kind of double the impact in rural areas to urban areas. And I actually think it is interesting. It's kind of a broader point that we do look beyond our borders sometimes for examples. And as we look to Europe or Australia or New Zealand or Canada, what are folks doing there? And I know Australia is another place that I've been working with a little bit, and they've had models for a really long time for rural areas because they have very remote communities. And for a long time, they've had these models where remote communities have some form of distance learning. And so how can we look beyond our borders as well, perhaps, for some of the solutions?
Anyone else want to chime in on that, Kristen?
I'll just encourage the folks who are here today. We do disaggregate by suburban, rural, urban in our reports, even though I didn't have time to go into that today. And these when we do find these case studies, these schools and districts to highlight, we are looking for districts and schools who are working in areas that are, well, I don't want to say we're only looking in rural areas, but we are most interested in highlighting districts that are, I don't know if I like the phrase beating the odds or not, but they are really overcoming what a lot of people assume based on historical data are characteristics that would make them have additional challenges, like being in a rural area. So I just encourage you to continue to look for these examples and case studies that we intend to continue to publish.
Hedy, I think you're on mute again.
And while she's unmuting, I'll just encourage everyone who's listening to take just a quick moment to respond to the poll that popped up on your screen a while ago. We'd love to get your feedback on this conversation. Now back to you. Oh no. Okay, all right, not back to Hedy. Well, it's good to be able to see you. So Let's see. A question from S.Y. Mason Watson about, and this is probably for you, Cecilia, but others can chime in as well. How can chronic absenteeism, disengagement, and unfinished learning be addressed with greater access to digital resources and hybrid learning models? How can parents more effectively advocate for their scholars? So actually, it sounds like there's something for a lot of you to chime in there. So we'll start with you, Cecilia.
Okay, well, I'll start with the first part. Great questions. I think we learned a lot during the year in which most of us had to live in remote learning. And one of the things we've learned is that we can do a lot more via synchronous and asynchronous digital platforms than we ever thought we could. And that holds true for teaching and learning. Now, it's not perfect for every situation, but I think being able to flip quickly back and forth, for one thing, is going to save a lot of absences, right? So let's say you have to quarantine. You're perfectly capable of learning. You just shouldn't physically be in the same space. So if your teacher is able to switch on a camera and you can participate remotely, just like we participate remotely in meetings, that is seamless, it's fast, it makes a big difference. Or you are really sick and you have to stay home, but all your lessons are there ready for you asynchronously via whatever platform you're using. You can keep learning, right? And someone reaches out to you. So those things, I think we've learned partially, we haven't fully implemented, but if we did that, we would cut down a lot of the lost learning, falling behind, feeling disconnected. So there are lots of opportunities there. And I'll let others chime in. I'm sure there are many more ideas as well.
I'm excited that at the Education Trust, we actually just are kicking off a new research project where we are going to be working with schools and families to learn more from families about how family engagement was during COVID, or as if COVID isn't pre-pandemic and now during the pandemic, and what they feel they need in order to be better engaged by their school districts. I think there are some pretty good models out there, but the situation that all of our families have been dealing with over the past 2 years is definitely new and is going to take new models for engagement. I'm again, as a mother of 2 boys, being able to do my student teacher conferences online has sort of changed the way that I could engage and be more fully present instead of rushing to school and then having to rush back. But there are other ways, I think, when there is greater digital access. And again, let us not underestimate the divide that still remains. It is something that we need to stay on top of. And fortunately, the infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress does include a lot of new funding to help deal with the digital divide, and particularly targeted at rural communities. And hopefully it's going to take a while to build that up, but nonetheless, that's on the plan.
Just add one caveat that I think it's important to consider about when we're talking about the digital divide and engaging students in at-home learning. A really critical finding in our data that we've seen in several of our reports is that we see this interaction where the youngest learners were the most hard hit, particularly in high poverty schools. And I think that starts to point to the different experiences that's happening in the homes of high poverty families and the capacity of parents and caregivers, the kinds of jobs and employment situations they have, and whether they're able to support those youngest learners who have a harder time independently navigating online school. So we see in low poverty households, students, those youngest learners, they're faring fine, they're doing okay, but we see really the difference is really for the youngest learners in high poverty schools. So I think we need to be conscientious about their home environment and the extent to which they have grown-ups around them to help them navigate those situations, and putting a lot of onus on teachers to have to play, wear lots and lots of hats in the situation. That's really a challenge.
Therapy Center of Reinventing Public Education literally just published in January a report, Virtual Learning Now and Beyond, which I'm trying to find the link for, which is why I keep looking up, but I'll put that in the chat as well, because they're very thoughtful and nuanced about some of those both challenges and limitations, but also opportunities. So, after 2 years of virtual learning, we don't want to say, gosh, virtual learning is the answer to all of the impact of virtual learning. But at the same time, we do want to pull out places where it's going to be really useful, like really hard to staff courses, advanced placement physics. So being able to have any student be able to take any high school course, no matter where they are, or snow days where kids are sick, or around educator professional development. So some really places where it can actually be part of the solution, but we shouldn't kind of naively assume that the cause of the problem is also going to be our silver bullet to the solution.
I love what you said, Emma, because I think there are some things that we should absolutely think about continuing that we've learned during this, and we just need to be very mindful about who it served well and who it didn't serve well. And I think Kristen and Karyn said that as well.
And I did just find that and post it in the chat so folks can read that report.
Thank you for that. And just a reminder to folks, I'm seeing a lot of questions about all of the amazing links that have been posted in the chat, as well as the slides that you all have shared. All of those materials will go to all registrants in an email later this week, as well as this recording. So you'll be able to watch it and dig into all of this and explore the information later on. We had a couple of people asking about access to ESSER funds, whether or not nonprofits could access them, or only schools, or you have to partner with schools in order to access those funds. Would anyone like to reply to that?
I think someone said it in the chat, but yes, the funds primarily went to state and school districts. And in fact, the majority of the American Rescue Plan funds were to be sent to the school districts. And they are able to make grants to, or sub-grants, or to nonprofits as well. So you should definitely check in with the school district. We are just starting to gather, and there are a couple different organizations that are looking at how the dollars are being spent. It is a pretty tedious process because you actually have to, there's no requirement that they report on that. So you actually have to get on the phone, or, find somebody who has some information and then see if how helpful that information is. But one of the things that we absolutely encourage our advocates is to ask for that information. Just knowing whether your school district is spending the dollars in an effective way that is outcome oriented and touches on all the things all of us had mentioned today, will put you farther ahead in being able to accelerate learning and address our whole child needs, which is, what everybody's really focused on.
And I just dropped the link in the chat for a source of where some of the ESSER funding is going. It's a Burbio link where they're every week looking at more districts and trying to understand that data. The one thing I would think about as you're a nonprofit too on that is think about the funding cliff that's coming. And so think about how you can be useful to districts as they navigate the fact that they're going to have this funding for a while and then it's going to go away. And how can you be cognizant of that so that you're not building up programs that then need to be discontinued?
Well, we are rapidly coming to the end of our time together. Any final thoughts that you all would like to share before we do our closing?
I think I can speak for Hedy since she can't speak for herself. Thank you to all. It's been an amazing, informative session.
Thank you all. And as I was saying, just as we're beginning, we're very much praying that the beginning of 2023 is not a session on the reports of unfinished learning, but it's instead a session on all of the progress that's been made over the past year to support students to accelerate.
I agree.
Amen.
I will invite all of you back for that amazing session. Please save your calendars right now. Well, thank you all. This has been such an incredibly sobering conversation, but also incredible insights. And we do need to know the data about where we are if we're going to plan a strategy for really supporting the kids who've been most impacted. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Emma Dorn, to Kristen Huff, and to Karyn Lewis for sharing your data, to Denise Forte and Cecilia Leong for sharing your insights and expertise on that data and how we can respond. Thank you to Hedy Chang for moderating the conversation and helping me plan it, and even finding a way to come back without power afterwards. And thank you to all of you who joined in. The chat box has been on fire throughout this conversation, as has the Q&A box. So thank you for all of the insights and examples of innovations that all of you have shared and your engagement in this session. I know there were a lot of questions about usage of ESSER funding, so I hope that everyone will join us later on this afternoon at 3 p.m. We are co-hosting a session with Children's Funding Project, which is looking at some innovative uses of ESSER funding, and also sharing an interactive tool that you can use to advocate for better usage of these federal dollars, ARPA and ESSER. So I hope you'll join me for that. There's a link in the chat box. And then if we could bring back the slides, we've got some more great GLR Learning Tuesdays sessions planned for the coming weeks. Next week, we will have, we'll continue the conversation about data, this time looking at early childhood, with Phil Fisher presenting some of the data from Rapid EC about families with young children ages 0 to 5. So I hope you'll come back to continue learning about data for that session. And then we'll be more great sessions in February, with one with Jose Munoz exploring the power and potential of community schools on February 1st. And then a session co-hosted by First Book that's looking at this research into the potential of using same language subtitling as a way to support early literacy development. Links for both of those are posted in the chat box. So I hope you'll join us for all of those. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Stay safe as throughout this Omicron variant, and look forward to seeing you throughout the year. Bye-bye.
Bye.